The quiet roads of East Texas, in December of 1980, held a kind of stillness that felt eternal. Pines stretched endlessly toward the night sky, their dark silhouettes swaying gently in the cool winter breeze. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke from distant fireplaces, the kind of comforting aroma that reminds you of home, safety, and traditions older than memory. On nights like these, the stars seemed sharper, as though each one was etched into the heavens with deliberate care. In small rural communities scattered across Texas, this sight was ordinary, yet never truly lost its quiet magic. For Betty Cash, Vicki Landrum, and young Colby, the evening began like countless others, uneventful, the hum of a car engine carrying them along a lonely two-lane road. They had no reason to expect that the journey would soon lead them into the heart of one of the most perplexing unsolved mysteries in modern American history. It was, after all, just another December night. Families were preparing for Christmas, stores glowed with holiday decorations, while radios carried both country music and seasonal hymns. Yet under the serene skies, a sense of unease was waiting to surface. To understand what they encountered that night, it helps to step back into the broader mood of America in 1980. The nation was at the tail end of the Cold War, a period when the possibility of nuclear confrontation lingered in people's subconscious like an invisible weight. News cycles carried stories of missiles, superpower standoffs, and experimental aircraft. Ordinary citizens were accustomed to hearing about secret military projects, whispered in rumor, and sometimes revealed years later as fact. The skies were no longer just for stars and clouds. They were, in the minds of many, a stage for surveillance, weapons testing, and perhaps, just perhaps, something not of this earth. The fascination with unidentified flying objects had been building for decades. Since the Roswell incident of 1947, Americans had looked skyward with a blend of wonder and suspicion. By the late 1970s, UFO reports had entered mainstream awareness, fueled by films, books, and television shows that blurred the line between entertainment and genuine testimony. Skeptics dismissed such accounts as misidentified planes or optical illusions, but believers argued that so many consistent stories could not be ignored. This cultural backdrop mattered, because when ordinary people like Betty and Vicki witnessed something extraordinary, their experiences were filtered through the cultural lens of UFO mythology and Cold War secrecy. And yet, on that December evening, none of this was at the forefront of their minds. They were simply driving. The pine forest pressed close against the narrow road, branches interlacing above in places that almost resembled a tunnel. Headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of gravel, road signs, and the occasional reflection of an animal's eyes darting back into the woods. Inside the car, conversation was simple, the way it often is when family and friends share the road. Reminders about plans, small talk, perhaps even comfortable silences, broken only by the rhythmic sound of tires rolling forward. There is something inherently calming about a night drive. The world outside shrinks to the narrow beam of headlights, the rest dissolving into obscurity. Time feels slower, and the mind drifts between focus and daydream. For the three travelers, this quiet rhythm was soon interrupted by a distant glow in the sky, something that seemed at first glance like it could be a plane, or perhaps a star burning unusually bright. It was faint, unremarkable, not yet alarming. But in the stillness of the Texas night, even small anomalies stood out. That faint glow would grow, shift, and eventually transform into something they could not explain. But before reaching that moment, one must appreciate the contrast. The normalcy of their evening, the ordinariness of a quiet country road, is what makes the encounter that followed so disorienting. When mystery emerges out of routine, it strikes with more force, shaking the foundation of what people believe is possible. The three witnesses were not looking for UFOs. They were not researchers or conspiracy theorists. They were simply citizens on their way home, carrying with them the everyday concerns of life. and perhaps that is what makes their testimony so compelling. The environment around them only heightened the strangeness. East Texas at night can feel both intimate and infinite, the forest enclosing you, yet the sky above stretching endlessly. It is the kind of place where human presence feels small against the vastness of nature. In such a setting, anything unusual, especially something bright, large or silent in the sky, can quickly take on an otherworldly quality. Psychologists often note that the human brain struggles to contextualize unexpected lights in the dark. Distances become hard to judge, size and speed blur, and fear amplifies perception. But what Betty, Vicky, and Colby would soon describe went far beyond tricks of the mind. Before diving into the raw encounter itself, it is important to pause here, at the threshold of the event. Imagine the hush of the car interior, the road stretching endlessly ahead, and the simple assumption that the night would remain uneventful. The stars twinkle above, the pines whisper in the cold air, and the world feels timeless. In that timelessness, mystery waits. It waits not as a loud, dramatic entrance, but as a gradual intrusion, a glow on the horizon, a presence not yet defined. The stage was set, and once mystery steps onto a stage like this, it rarely leaves quietly. The Cash Landrum incident was about to unfold, not as a passing rumor or a fleeting misidentification, but as a deeply personal experience that would leave physical, emotional, and cultural scars. For now, though, the listeners are still in the calm before the storm, suspended in the beauty of a Texas night. The pine forest holds its breath, the stars remain steady, and three travelers unknowingly approach the extraordinary. The glow on the horizon grew steadily brighter as the car carried its passengers deeper into the pine-lined road. At first, it could have been mistaken for the lights of a small town ahead, or perhaps the glare of an aircraft in descent, but soon, Betty, who was driving, realized that the illumination was moving, shifting in ways no ordinary light should. The road itself seemed to bend toward it, drawing them closer whether they wished to approach or not. Vicky and young Colby watched too, their quiet conversation fading, as all three began to sense that something extraordinary was unfolding before them. Then, almost without warning, the craft revealed itself. Hovering directly over the road ahead was an immense, diamond-shaped object, radiating an intense, fiery glow. The light was unlike anything they had seen before, golden, almost molten, as though the object was burning from within. Its edges were sharp against the night sky, too defined to be a trick of the eyes. It hovered low, so low that the travelers could not continue forward. The road was blocked by the impossible. The silence of the night was broken not by the roar of engines, but by a deep, low hum that seemed to vibrate in their bones. And then there was the heat, a wave of scorching warmth pressed against the car, as if they had driven too close to an open furnace. Betty instinctively stopped the vehicle, stunned, her hands tightening around the steering wheel. The interior of the car grew unbearably hot, the air thick and suffocating. It was as though the atmosphere itself was being cooked. Psychologists often describe moments like this as cognitive dissonance in real time. The human mind, trained to interpret reality within familiar rules, suddenly faces a sight that does not belong to any known category. A diamond-shaped craft hovering inches above the ground, emitting searing heat and light, simply does not fit into the mental frameworks built on years of ordinary experience. And so the mind falters, swinging between awe, terror, and disbelief. For Betty, Vicky, and Colby, that confusion was accompanied by very real physical sensations: the burn of the heat, the blinding glare, the suffocating atmosphere. This was not a dream. Colby, young and frightened, began to cry, pleading with his grandmother to pray. Vicky, trying to soothe him, did exactly that, calling upon faith to shield them from whatever they were witnessing. Betty, however, was transfixed. Against every instinct to flee, she stepped out of the car, wanting to see the object clearly, to make sense of what hovered before them. The heat struck her immediately, fierce and punishing, searing against her skin. Her eyes watered, but she remained outside for several moments, compelled by a mixture of shock and curiosity. In later years, she would recall the surface of the craft, metallic, rough in places, glowing as though alive. It is easy for us, in the calm of reflection, to imagine what we might have done differently. Perhaps we would have turned the car around, sped away, avoided the danger. But fear often paralyzes, and awe can hold a person still longer than fear alone. The three witnesses were caught in that paradoxical state, wanting escape, yet unable to look away. The craft itself seemed unstable, shifting slightly in its position, tilting as though under strain. Flames or exhaust-like bursts occasionally shot from its underside, scorching the pavement. The road shimmered in the heat. The pine branches nearest the object swayed, though the night air was otherwise still. Details like these, later reported in testimony, added weight to their account. This was not a mere trick of light. The environment itself reacted. Inside the car, Vicky urged Betty to return, fearful that the strange craft was harming her. Reluctantly, Betty climbed back in, but the heat did not relent. The steering wheel and dashboard felt hot to the touch, as though the car itself were absorbing the radiation of the object. The atmosphere was oppressive, heavy, leaving them dizzy and breathless. The child wept, the adults prayed, and outside, the diamond-shaped craft continued to loom with silent menace. Then a new sound cut through the night, the thudding rhythm of rotor blades. From the distance, military-style helicopters began to appear, their navigation lights blinking in the darkness. At first there were only a few, then more. Witnesses later estimated between 20 and 25 helicopters encircling the strange craft. The juxtaposition was striking. An unknown glowing machine, seemingly damaged or unstable, and dozens of military aircraft accompanying it. Were they pursuing it, escorting it, or attempting to contain something that had gone terribly wrong? The sight of helicopters did little to reassure the witnesses. If anything, it deepened the dread. The presence of official aircraft suggested knowledge, secrecy, perhaps even complicity. Betty and Vicky could not know whether they were in danger from the object itself, or from whatever operation was unfolding above them. Eventually, with a surge of force, the glowing craft lifted higher into the air, the heat lessening slightly as it ascended. Still flanked by helicopters, it moved away into the distance, leaving behind only scorched pavement and the lingering imprint of fear. Slowly, the travelers regained enough composure to continue down the road, but their lives had been changed in those minutes. They carried with them not only the memory of what they had seen, but also the physical effects of the encounter. What had begun as an ordinary drive had become an indelible mystery, and though the craft had vanished into the Texas night, its presence clung to them in their skin, in their minds, and in their futures. The encounter was over, but the true ordeal was only beginning. When the car finally pulled away from the site of the encounter, the three travelers carried more than fear with them. At first, it was subtle. Betty complained of a pounding headache, her skin tingling uncomfortably. Vicky felt drained, lightheaded, while young Colby, exhausted from crying, slumped in his seat with a strange, uneasy stillness. They had all been shaken, but no one yet grasped the physical toll the experience would exact in the hours and days ahead. By the time they reached home, the first symptoms were undeniable. Betty's face and hands were flushed red, her eyes watering, as though she had stared too long at a sun she could not escape. She assumed it was temporary, the kind of irritation that would pass after rest, but by morning, the redness had deepened into severe burns. Blisters formed on her scalp and skin, painful to the touch. Her eyes swelled, vision blurring. Soon, she found herself unable to rise from bed without help. Vicky and Colby fared better, though not without suffering. Both experienced nausea and bouts of diarrhea, strange rashes appearing on their bodies. Their hair felt brittle, dry, as if scorched by invisible flames. For Vicky, the experience took on an eerie resonance. She had always turned to faith for comfort, but now she wondered if they had come face to face with something not only unknown, but dangerous, something that tested the very boundaries of what she believed to be divine or earthly. Doctors would later puzzle over Betty's condition. Her burns resembled radiation exposure more than thermal injury. She suffered hair loss, skin lesions, and recurring bouts of weakness. Hospital stays stretched from days into weeks, her body showing patterns of damage inconsistent with ordinary illness. And yet, without a clear cause, physicians hesitated to commit to any explanation. No laboratory results confirmed high doses of radiation, but the symptoms could not be ignored. Psychologists studying cases like this often point out the profound overlap between physical trauma and psychological stress. A terrifying encounter in the night, followed by severe burns and illness, naturally created an environment of anxiety and fear. Was the body manifesting the stress, or was stress layered on top of very real injury? The Cash Landrum case blurred these lines in ways that challenged medical certainty. For Betty, the suffering went beyond the physical. Friends noticed how her personality shifted in the wake of the incident. Once lively, she grew withdrawn, consumed by fatigue and a sense of injustice. Vicky, though deeply religious, struggled with lingering fear whenever she drove along rural roads at night. Even Colby, though just a boy, carried memories of the blinding light and the unbearable heat. Childhood fears usually fade. This one remained vivid, etched into him with the permanence of trauma. In a broader context, their symptoms resonated with Cold War anxieties. In 1980, Americans lived under the shadow of nuclear power, its promises and its perils. Stories of radiation poisoning, of workers exposed to hazardous tests, of families downwind of nuclear facilities, were part of the cultural landscape. That 3 ordinary citizens might have been harmed by some form of advanced technology, whether military or otherwise, fit uneasily into those anxieties. Their suffering was not abstract, it was visible on their skin. And yet, the official silence around their case deepened the wound. Without acknowledgement, without explanation, they were left to wonder whether the burns were evidence of human negligence or a brush with something truly extraterrestrial. Either way, the trauma was real. Betty's health continued to decline over the years, her life expectancy shortened by chronic illness. Vicky and Colby carried scars less visible, but no less permanent. The fallout of the Cash Landrum incident was not measured only in testimony or photographs, but in the fragile bodies of its witnesses. Their pain forced a haunting question into the public sphere: what price is paid when the unknown collides with the ordinary? And perhaps even more unsettling, was anyone accountable, or was this simply the cost of encountering a mystery too vast for explanation? In the quiet aftermath of the glowing craft's departure, one detail refused to fade from memory. Alongside the diamond-shaped object, a swarm of helicopters had appeared, their rotor blades thundering against the night sky. Betty, Vicky, and Colby all remembered them clearly. Dark shapes moving in formation, dozens of them, their lights blinking as if guiding or escorting the strange craft. To the witnesses, the meaning was obvious. This was no random sighting. Someone knew. Someone was watching. Someone, perhaps, was in control. The presence of helicopters became one of the most puzzling aspects of the Cash Landrum case. Eyewitnesses disagreed on the exact number, but most placed the count between 20 and 25. For a quiet rural stretch of Texas road, that kind of coordinated presence seemed impossible to dismiss. The question that followed was unavoidable. Why would so many military aircraft be converging on a craft that, according to official statements, did not exist? The early 1980s were a time of feverish technological development in U.S. defense. Secretive programs unfolded in the skies above deserts and forests, often shielded from public scrutiny for years before being revealed. Stealth technology, advanced propulsion, and nuclear-powered prototypes were whispered about in defense circles, even as officials denied their existence. Within that atmosphere, The possibility that the glowing craft was an experimental U.S. vehicle seemed to fit, and if that were true, then the helicopters were not witnesses like Betty and Vicky, but guardians, ensuring the safety of something not meant for civilian eyes. Researchers who later studied the case pointed out that military exercises often did involve large numbers of helicopters, particularly in training for troop transport and combat support. Fort Hood, one of the largest military installations in the United States, was not impossibly far from the encounter site. Could the travelers have stumbled upon a classified test, one that went catastrophically wrong? If the craft was leaking radiation or unstable energy, it might explain both the burns and the secrecy. But doubt lingers. For all the rumors, no official records ever placed that number of helicopters in the area on that December night. The Air Force denied involvement, insisting that no such operation was underway. Skeptics seized on this silence as proof that the helicopters had been a misperception, a trick of frightened eyes dazzled by light and fear. Yet it is difficult to dismiss three consistent testimonies, each describing the sound, the shape, the circling movement of rotorcraft overhead. Their descriptions were not vague. They recalled the distinctive chop of blades, the navigation lights, the organized way the machines encircled the unknown craft. Psychologically, the presence of helicopters served as both reassurance and threat. For Vicky, rooted in faith and a deep trust in authority, the sight of military aircraft might have suggested control, even protection. If the object was dangerous, surely the government knew and would contain it. For Betty, suffering burns and fear, the helicopters only deepened suspicion. If the authorities were there, why did they not intervene? Why was a family left exposed on a lonely road, while an operation of such scale unfolded overhead? The helicopters also reinforced one of the most enduring themes in UFO history: the shadow of government secrecy. Since the earliest days of the phenomenon, witnesses had described military presence, strange men in unmarked uniforms, vehicles arriving at crash sites, helicopters circling above remote encounters. The Cash Landrum sighting fit into this larger pattern, feeding speculation that governments not only knew more than they admitted, but were actively managing the boundaries of public awareness. There is another angle worth considering. Some researchers argue that if the helicopters were truly there, their role may not have been to protect, but to monitor. If the craft was not of U.S. origin, if it was something truly unknown, the military presence could have represented a desperate effort to track it, to study it from a distance without engaging. In this interpretation, Betty, Vicky, and Colby were not caught in the middle of a test gone wrong, but in a surveillance operation against something no one fully understood. And yet, for all these theories, no proof emerged. No flight logs confirmed the helicopters. No pilots stepped forward. The official stance remained silence. This absence of confirmation is what gives the Cash Landrum case its haunting edge. Without records, the swarm of rotorcraft hovers in memory like phantoms, reported, described, but never acknowledged. The human mind craves explanation, and in the years that followed, researchers debated whether the helicopters were real, imagined, or intentionally erased from history. But for Betty, Vicky, and Colby, there was no debate. They heard them, they saw them, and in their memory, the helicopters remain as vivid as the glowing craft itself. The presence of military machines tied the mystery firmly to questions of authority, secrecy, and trust. If the government was involved, why were citizens left to suffer radiation burns without help or acknowledgement? And if the government was not involved, then what does it mean that unidentified helicopters filled the sky around an object not of this world? Both possibilities are unsettling. Both leave ordinary people powerless in the face of forces far larger than themselves. In the end, the helicopters deepened the shadow over the case, turning it from a strange personal encounter into a story that touched national defense, secrecy, and the uneasy intersection between government power and public vulnerability. The night was no longer just about an unknown craft. It was about authority moving in the dark, unseen yet undeniably present, leaving only questions in its wake. By the time weeks had turned into months, It was no longer possible for Betty Cash or Vicky Landrum to dismiss their suffering as temporary. The burns on Betty's body had left her weakened, her hair fell out in clumps, and her health seemed permanently altered. Vicky and young Colby, though less severely injured, still carried the marks of that December night. They had endured not only the pain of their encounter, but the bewildering silence that followed. No official stepped forward to explain what they had seen. No authority offered aid. The helicopters, so vivid in memory, had dissolved into denial. For the women, silence became the cruelest injury of all. Faced with rising medical bills and the lingering burden of illness, Betty and Vicky turned toward the only avenue they believed might deliver justice: the law. In 1981, they began the process of filing a legal claim against the U.S. government, arguing that the mysterious craft and the radiation-like exposure had caused them direct harm. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary act. Few civilians had ever taken the government to court over a UFO sighting, and fewer still with such devastating personal consequences. Their attorney, a man named Peter Gersten, was sympathetic to their case. Gersten had long been involved in legal battles surrounding government secrecy and UFO phenomena. He argued that if military helicopters had indeed been present, then the craft itself was either a secret U.S. project or something the government had direct knowledge of. In either case, the government held responsibility for the injuries suffered by the witnesses. The lawsuit demanded compensation, recognition, and accountability. The courtroom, however, is a place where mystery rarely finds sympathy. Government lawyers countered with an immovable defense. No record existed of any such operation on that night, and therefore no liability could be assigned. Without documents, without flight logs, without a paper trail, there was no evidence, only testimony. And in the cold calculus of law, testimony without corroboration was not enough. The proceedings dragged on for years. Doctors testified to the severity of Betty's condition, noting burns and illnesses consistent with radiation exposure. But when pressed, they admitted they could not prove causation. Experts debated whether the symptoms could have arisen from other sources, or whether psychological trauma had intensified physical ailments. The government remained steadfast in its denial. No craft, no operation, no responsibility. For Betty and Vicky, the trial was more than a legal battle. It was an emotional crucible. Each hearing forced them to relive the encounter, to recount the pain, the light, the heat, the helicopters. Each dismissal of their claims felt like a dismissal of their truth, and yet, they endured convinced that justice required persistence. In 1986, after years of motions, hearings, and appeals, the case was dismissed. The court ruled that the plaintiffs had failed to provide sufficient evidence linking their injuries to any government activity. The verdict was a crushing blow. Not only did it deny them compensation, but it also cemented the official silence surrounding their experience. For the record, nothing had happened on that December night. Their pain remained invisible to the very authorities they believed had been present in the skies above them. The lawsuit, though unsuccessful, left behind a legacy. It remains one of the only instances where civilians directly challenged the U.S. government in connection to a UFO encounter. It forced the subject into legal and public record, preserving testimony and medical documentation that might otherwise have vanished. For researchers, the case became a touchstone, a reminder that some mysteries carry consequences too tangible to ignore. But for Betty, the toll was deeply personal. Her health never recovered, and the stress of the trial weighed heavily on her final years. For Vicky, the disappointment cut sharply against her lifelong trust in institutions. Both women had entered the process believing that truth, once spoken, would compel acknowledgement. Instead, they discovered that silence could be louder than testimony, and denial stronger than suffering. At its heart, the legal battle underscored a chilling possibility. If the government had been involved, then denial was deliberate, a shield against responsibility. And if the government had not been involved, then 3 citizens had been injured by something completely unknown, and no authority existed to answer for it. In both scenarios, the result was the same. Betty, Vicky, and Colby stood alone. The court's dismissal did not erase their story. Instead, it became part of the haunting pattern that surrounds so many UFO cases: vivid encounters, human trauma, and a system that refuses to acknowledge either. For those who study the phenomenon, the Cash Landrum lawsuit remains a symbol of how truth can vanish into the silence of bureaucracy, leaving behind only questions and scars. When the Cash Landrum encounter first came to light, it was not through government channels or official reports, but through the slow and uncertain trickle of local news. At first, the story seemed almost too strange for reporters to take seriously. A glowing diamond-shaped craft, intense heat, radiation-like burns, and a swarm of unmarked helicopters. It sounded like the outline of a science fiction novel rather than a local human interest piece. Yet as the women's symptoms worsened, and as they began to speak publicly about what had happened to them, the story started to make its way into newspapers and radio broadcasts across Texas. The initial reaction from the press was one of fascination mixed with hesitation. Journalists were drawn to the vivid detail of the account, the blinding light, the heat that made their skin blister, the 30 helicopters circling the sky. Yet there was also a sense of disbelief. UFO stories, after all, were often treated as light-hearted oddities, tucked between weather reports and sports columns. But the suffering of Betty Cash and the quiet, sincere testimony of Vicki and Colby Landrum made this account harder to dismiss. This was not merely a tale of lights in the sky. It was a story of human injury, of physical evidence carried on the skin and in the blood. Television soon followed. Interviews captured Betty in her hospital bed, her weakened body lending gravity to every word she spoke. Viewers could see for themselves the toll this incident had taken. For audiences at home, the story stirred a deep unease. It was one thing to hear about strange lights or flying saucers. It was another to see a woman whose health seemed shattered by what she claimed to have encountered. The images broadcast across living rooms in the early 1980s carried a quiet but undeniable power. Public reaction grew steadily, not only in Texas, but nationwide. Some expressed sympathy and believed wholeheartedly in the women's testimony. To them, Betty, Vicki, and Colby were courageous survivors who deserved truth and justice. Others, however, remained skeptical. Critics pointed out the absence of corroborating witnesses on the road that night. Skeptics argued that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and in the absence of photographs, physical wreckage, or military confirmation, doubt thrived. Still, the story would not fade. UFO researchers, often dismissed as fringe enthusiasts, found in the Cash Landrum case something different from the usual lights in the sky reports. Here was a case with severe medical aftereffects, consistent testimony, and an alleged military presence. It drew the attention of well-known investigators, including members of the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, and independent researchers, who sought to gather evidence and interview the witnesses in depth. For these investigators, the case represented a bridge between the mysterious and the undeniable. Even if the origin of the craft remained uncertain, the suffering of the witnesses was indisputable. As researchers published their findings, the case entered a wider cultural dialogue. Magazine articles framed it as one of the most credible UFO incidents in American history. Radio programs hosted late-night discussions where callers shared their own stories of strange lights and close encounters. For those who had long felt that the UFO phenomenon was real but ignored, the Cash Landrum story was validation. It suggested not only that something extraordinary was happening in the skies, but also that it could leave lasting marks on the people who experienced it. The media attention, however, also came at a cost to the witnesses. With visibility came scrutiny, and with scrutiny came doubt. Betty, Vicki, and Colby were forced to live not only with their illnesses, but with the burden of proving their honesty to a skeptical public. Each interview became a trial, each retelling a test of credibility. For Betty, who was already suffering physically, this public skepticism was deeply painful. For Vicki, a woman of strong faith, disbelief cut against her sense of trust and community. And for young Colby, the story became a shadow over his childhood, a memory that followed him into adulthood, shaped by a media storm he had not asked for. In time, the case grew into something larger than a local mystery. It became part of the broader UFO narrative in America, a narrative that stretched from Roswell to Rendlesham, from Project Blue Book to whispers of Area 51. The Cash Landrum incident stood out, however, for its human cost. Media outlets returned to it again and again because it was not just a tale of lights and shadows. It was a story about ordinary people caught in something extraordinary and paying the price for it. Even decades later, the case continues to appear in documentaries, podcasts, and television specials exploring the UFO phenomenon. For some, it remains one of the most persuasive encounters ever documented. For others, it is a reminder of how mystery and media intertwine, how stories can grow, evolve, and endure, even without official confirmation. Ultimately, the public reaction to the Cash Landrum incident revealed a deep divide. On one side stood belief, the conviction that the witnesses had encountered something real, whether secret military technology or something otherworldly. On the other side stood skepticism, the insistence that without hard evidence, the story was little more than an elaborate misinterpretation or exaggeration. Between these poles stood the witnesses themselves, caught in a media spotlight that illuminated both their suffering and their isolation. In the calm of night, when the broadcasts faded and the newspapers were folded away, the story lingered. Viewers remembered the image of Betty Cash in her hospital bed, remembered the steady voice of Vicky Landrum, remembered the shadow of helicopters against a winter sky. And whether they believed or doubted, they carried with them the unsettling thought that something had happened on that Texas road, something unresolved, something unanswered, something that even now hovers between mystery and truth. As with so many UFO cases, the Cash Landrum incident did not remain confined to a single interpretation. From the earliest days of the story, researchers, skeptics, and officials all tried to impose meaning on the strange events of December 1980. Each theory offered a possible answer, yet each carried its own difficulties, contradictions, and blind spots. In the years that followed, these competing explanations created a web of possibilities, each one as haunting as the original mystery. The first and most widely discussed theory was that the witnesses had encountered a secret U.S. military project. The presence of dozens of helicopters seemed to point in that direction. What kind of civilian operation could deploy so many aircraft, moving in such formation, over Texas in the middle of the night? Some investigators speculated that the diamond-shaped craft was an experimental vehicle, perhaps nuclear-powered, that had malfunctioned during a test flight. The heat, the flames, the unstable behavior of the craft, all of these details could, in theory, align with a high-risk prototype under military escort. For many, this theory explained both the symptoms of radiation exposure and the government's refusal to acknowledge involvement. To admit responsibility would mean exposing not only a failed experiment, but also the harm inflicted on innocent civilians. Yet this explanation carried troubling gaps. If the craft had been military, why was there no flight log, no official record, no acknowledgement, even decades later? Moreover, why would such a dangerous test flight take place over a public highway, in proximity to ordinary citizens? The secrecy of the military is legendary, but secrecy does not easily account for negligence of that scale. And though experimental craft are known to exist, few are designed to emit enough radiation-like energy to cause severe burns to bystanders. The military theory, while plausible, left open questions that resisted neat resolution. The second major theory veered into the realm of the extraordinary, that the Cash Landrum witnesses had encountered something not of this world. The craft's strange shape, the intense beam of light, the physical effects, it all bore a resemblance to other close encounter cases reported throughout the 20th century. Proponents of this view argued that the helicopters themselves might not have been escorting the object, but rather attempting to intercept it. To them, the image of a malfunctioning alien craft, struggling in Earth's skies, with military forces scrambling to contain the event, seemed almost cinematic in its plausibility. In this interpretation, the U.S. government's silence was not the silence of guilt, but of impotence. They had witnessed the unknown, alongside Betty, Vicky, and Colby, but could neither explain nor control it. For those who lean toward the extraterrestrial explanation, the case stands as one of the most convincing in history. It merges the mystery of UFO flight with the tangible evidence of human injury. Skeptics, however, point out that belief in alien visitation requires a leap beyond known science. The extraterrestrial theory may explain what other theories cannot, but it also opens the door to speculation that is difficult, if not impossible, to verify. Other researchers turn to psychological and environmental explanations. Could the witnesses have been exposed to a terrestrial but unusual source of radiation, perhaps from a leaking industrial facility or a misfired military weapon? Could the helicopters have been unrelated, their appearance a coincidence woven into the memory of the night? Some skeptics suggested that the women's symptoms might have been aggravated by stress, by chemical exposure from another source, or by the natural decline of health in the years that followed. Human memory, they argued, is not a perfect recorder. In moments of trauma and awe, recollections can blend, exaggerate, or misinterpret events. And yet, the psychological theory struggled against the weight of physical evidence. Betty's burns, her hair loss, her documented hospitalizations, these were not figments of imagination. Nor could Colby's frightened testimony, given as a child, be easily explained as mass suggestion. If stress or memory error played a role, they seemed insufficient to account for the depth of the injuries sustained. Another theory centered on space technology. At the time, whispers circulated about the possibility of nuclear-powered rocket engines being developed under classified programs. Some researchers speculated that the craft might have been a prototype linked to Project Nerva or other nuclear propulsion experiments. If such a device had been airborne and malfunctioning, the symptoms described by the witnesses could align with radiation leakage. The helicopters, in this theory, would have been part of an emergency containment operation. Yet, once again, the problem of evidence arose. No declassified documents have ever confirmed such a test occurring in Texas on that night. Nor do records support the idea that nuclear-powered vehicles were flown in populated areas. Beyond these explanations, the case drew in more speculative ideas. Some suggested plasma phenomena, a natural but poorly understood atmospheric event, could have caused the blinding light and heat. Others spoke of secret weapons programs, perhaps involving lasers or microwave technologies, accidentally or deliberately tested near civilians. A few even suggested that the craft was neither alien nor military, but something stranger still, an interdimensional event, a vision bleeding into reality. Such ideas occupied the outer edges of interpretation, but they reveal the way the case fueled imagination and unease. What makes the Cash Landrum incident particularly haunting is that no single theory has ever managed to dominate the discussion. Each explanation answers certain questions while leaving others unresolved. If it was military, where is the record? If extraterrestrial, why so vulnerable, so flawed? If psychological, how do we explain the burns? If environmental, why the helicopters? The mystery refuses reduction, remaining a puzzle that defies the simple closure of explanation. For the witnesses themselves, these theories were of little comfort. Betty Cash, who suffered the most, remained convinced, until her death, that the craft was military. Vicky Landrum, grounded in her faith, leaned toward the belief that what they saw might have been beyond human origin. Colby, the boy who grew into a man under the shadow of that night, has expressed frustration that the debate continues, while the suffering of his family is treated as a footnote in speculative arguments. And so the theories swirl, decade after decade, never settling into certainty. For those who seek answers, the case is both a gift and a curse. It offers tantalizing detail, documented evidence, and credible witnesses, but it denies resolution, leaving researchers to circle endlessly, much like the helicopters in the night sky over Texas, orbiting a mystery they cannot quite capture. The Cash Landrum incident did not fade into silence once the courts had dismissed the case and the newspapers moved on. Instead, it carved out a peculiar space in the cultural memory of the UFO phenomenon, becoming a touchstone for researchers, believers and skeptics alike. It is remembered not only as one of the most compelling UFO encounters in American history, but also as a story that speaks to the human side of mystery, suffering, persistence, and the longing for truth. In the early 1980s, UFO culture was entering a new phase. The Cold War was still shaping public consciousness, and the skies seemed more crowded than ever with rumors of secret aircraft, satellites, and unacknowledged experiments. At the same time, the UFO community was increasingly organized, with groups like MUFON gaining members and credibility. Against this backdrop, the Cash Landrum case became a symbol of the intersection between human cost and unexplained phenomena. Unlike stories of lights in the sky or distant encounters, this one involved burns, hospital stays, lawsuits, and helicopters in numbers too large to dismiss casually. Researchers saw it as a rare opportunity to point to something tangible. For the general public, the story resonated on another level. It was unsettling to imagine that ordinary people driving home from dinner could stumble into something so extraordinary and so dangerous. The image of Betty Cash, a woman who never sought fame, battling illness after her encounter, cut against the stereotype of UFO witnesses as thrill seekers or fantasists. It suggested instead that the phenomenon could intrude into anyone's life, uninvited and uncompromising. This realization created a ripple of unease. If Betty, Vicky, and Colby could be touched by mystery, who was truly safe? The case also influenced how UFOs were portrayed in media and entertainment. In documentaries of the 1980s and 1990s, the Cash Landrum story was frequently cited as one of the best documented examples of a harmful close encounter. Television specials included reenactments, often dramatizing the glowing craft, the searing heat, and the swarm of helicopters overhead. These images etched themselves into the collective imagination, reinforcing the idea that UFOs were not always benevolent, not always distant, but sometimes perilously close and harmful. Even fictional portrayals in films and television borrowed elements of the Cash Landrum narrative: the light in the road, the burning heat, the mixture of awe and terror. For the UFO research community, the case became both an inspiration and a challenge. On one hand, it offered medical records, sworn testimony, and an official lawsuit, elements that gave it more weight than many other encounters. On the other hand, the absence of definitive proof kept it locked in the realm of mystery. Researchers often cited it in conferences, books, and articles as one of the top 5 most puzzling cases. Its place alongside Roswell, Rendlesham Forest, and other legendary encounters helped shape the canon of modern UFO lore, but its legacy extended beyond UFO culture. In legal circles, the case was sometimes referenced as an example of the difficulty in assigning liability for events tied to secrecy or phenomena outside established frameworks. In psychology, the incident was used to discuss the reliability of memory under stress, the physical effects of trauma, and the social pressures placed on extraordinary witnesses. In cultural studies, the story was examined as part of the American relationship with government secrecy, Cold War anxiety, and the fascination with the unknown. In each of these fields, the case found a place as more than a curiosity. It became a lens through which broader cultural questions could be explored. The story also lingered in the lives of those who came after. For believers, it served as a rallying cry. If even victims with medical evidence could not secure acknowledgement, what hope did any witness have of finding truth? For skeptics, it remained a stubborn puzzle, a story that could not be easily explained away, yet resisted conclusive proof. For ordinary people, it became another chapter in the long history of whispers about what really moves through our skies. One of the most enduring aspects of the Cash Landrum legacy is its sense of unresolved tension. Unlike Roswell, which over the decades grew into a sprawling myth, complete with alien bodies and crashed saucers, the Cash Landrum story remained sharp and human. It was never inflated into something more spectacular. Instead, its power lay in its restraint. 3 people saw something. They were hurt, they sought answers, and they were denied. This simplicity kept it alive as a story people could believe in, or at least feel deeply unsettled by. In later decades, as government disclosures about UFOs or UAPs unidentified aerial phenomena began to trickle out. Researchers often pointed back to the Cash Landrum case. If authorities were finally admitting that unusual craft had been tracked, filmed, or studied, then perhaps it was not unreasonable to think that what Betty, Vicky, and Colby encountered might fall into the same shadowy category. The re-emergence of serious discussion about UFOs in the 21st century gave new life to the case, framing it not as an isolated oddity, but as part of a larger, ongoing mystery. Ultimately, the cultural impact of the Cash Landrum incident lies in its refusal to be forgotten. It shaped how UFOs were discussed in both popular culture and serious research. It provided a rare example of a case where the human consequences were undeniable, even if the origin of the event was not, and it left behind a legacy that is still invoked whenever questions of government secrecy, unexplained encounters, and human suffering intersect. The story has become a kind of ghost in the cultural landscape, haunting, unresolved, and strangely intimate. It is remembered not only as a UFO case, but as a parable about how societies handle the unknown. Do we dismiss it? Do we confront it? Do we listen to those who suffer in its wake? These are the questions the Cash Landrum case continues to ask, long after the night sky over Texas grew quiet again. As the decades passed, the Cash Landrum incident did not simply vanish into the archives of forgotten UFO reports. Instead, it continued to resurface, studied, debated, and revisited by new generations of investigators. Each wave of interest seemed to breathe new life into the story, while at the same time underscoring how elusive true answers remained. In the 1990s, the rise of UFO documentaries and late-night radio programs brought renewed attention to the case. Researchers combed through old court records, medical files, and taped interviews with the witnesses. Betty Cash's hospital stays were analyzed in detail, her symptoms compared against known effects of radiation exposure. Skeptics pointed to inconsistencies, gaps in the timeline, the possibility of pre-existing health conditions. But for many, the weight of her suffering remained difficult to dismiss. Vicky and Colby's accounts, given repeatedly over the years, also showed remarkable consistency. The steadiness of their recollections suggested sincerity, even if the full truth behind their experience remained hidden. By the early 2000s, the case had become a staple in UFO literature. Authors writing encyclopedias of unexplained phenomena often included entire chapters on Cash Landrum, noting its unique blend of physical injury, multiple witnesses, and alleged military involvement. MUFON continued to treat it as a cornerstone case, highlighting it at conferences and in journals. For researchers seeking credibility in the field, it was an anchor, proof that not all UFO stories were vague lights in the sky or second-hand rumors. Here was a case with medical records, sworn legal testimony, and a trail of documentation. At the same time, technological advances allowed for new approaches. Some investigators used geospatial analysis to map the possible paths of helicopters and the craft, comparing them with known flight corridors and military facilities. Others revisited Cold War archives, hoping that declassified documents might reveal a secret program aligned with the witness descriptions. Yet, time and again, these efforts ran into silence. No paper trail surfaced to confirm a test flight. No military unit stepped forward to acknowledge involvement. The case remained locked in ambiguity, a puzzle that resisted the passage of time. In recent years, as governments have slowly reopened discussions of unidentified aerial phenomena, the Cash Landrum incident has returned to the spotlight. In 2017, the release of U.S. Navy footage showing unidentified craft, objects moving in ways beyond current technology, reshaped the conversation about UFOs. Suddenly, the stigma surrounding such discussions began to erode. Congressional hearings in the 2020s included testimony from pilots and officials who admitted that strange objects had been tracked and studied. Against this backdrop, the Cash Landrum case appeared less like an outlier and more like an early warning, an event that hinted, decades ago, at truths only now being acknowledged. Modern researchers ask pointed questions. If helicopters were indeed present that night, who commanded them? Could radar records, long buried, confirm their flight? Was the craft a malfunctioning piece of human technology, perhaps nuclear in nature, whose records remain classified? Or was it something wholly other, something still beyond explanation? The persistence of these questions speaks to the case's unique nature. Unlike many UFO reports, this one involves human harm, burns, illness, trauma. Those injuries are not matters of belief, but of record, and that fact makes the mystery harder to dismiss. If Betty Cash had not suffered so visibly, perhaps the story would have drifted into obscurity. But her pain anchored it in reality, a constant reminder that something powerful and dangerous moved through the Texas skies that night. For skeptics, the lasting question is whether human memory and interpretation can be trusted in such extraordinary circumstances. Could the witnesses have mistaken a conventional craft, perhaps a re-entry of space debris, or a flare from a military exercise, for something more exotic? Could the helicopters have been unrelated, their presence coincidental? These arguments, however, often falter against the sheer intensity of the witnesses' experiences. The heat, the light, the hovering diamond shape, such details resist easy reduction. For believers, the lasting question is one of accountability. If the craft was military, why has no disclosure come, even decades later? If it was not military, then what force harmed American citizens on their own soil? Why has no institution taken responsibility, offered answers, or even acknowledged the possibility? These questions linger not just for researchers, but for anyone who feels that government secrecy may extend deeper than admitted. And for the families themselves, the questions were deeply personal. Betty lived the rest of her life, carrying both the physical consequences and the frustration of never receiving recognition. Vicky struggled with faith in institutions, torn between her trust in God and her distrust of the government. Colby grew up with the memory of that night, shaping how he viewed the world, a reminder from childhood that reality can be stranger, harsher, and less safe than most people imagine. As modern investigations continue, the Cash Landrum incident stands as both a case study and a cautionary tale. It demonstrates the difficulties of proving extraordinary events in the absence of official acknowledgement. It shows how even well-documented cases can languish in ambiguity when governments choose silence. And it reminds us that mystery, once rooted in lived experience, has the power to persist across decades, defying easy closure. Perhaps the most haunting element of all is that the questions remain open. What was the craft? Why were the helicopters there? Why were the witnesses left to suffer without recognition? Each possibility, secret technology, extraterrestrial visitation, environmental anomaly, carries its own unsettling implications. Each answer, if ever confirmed, would reshape how we understand the night sky and the powers that move within it. And so the questions endure, much like the mystery itself. They hover in the background of UFO research, orbiting without resolution, as researchers, journalists, and dreamers continue to ask what really happened on that lonely Texas road in December 1980. The answers remain out of reach, yet the pursuit of them ensures that the Cash Landrum case lives on, an unsolved riddle etched in both human memory and cultural history, pointing toward mysteries still waiting in the dark.